In this episode of Doctor of Developer Experience, we're going to discuss the Pareto principle, quite famous, and how it's related to developer experience and why should you care. Before we go into the topic, reminder that if you want to continue the discussion on any of the topics and episodes of the dxdoctor, please participate in Twitter, and you should be able to find the discussions and everything with the hashtag dxdoctor. And if you want to follow me and discuss directly to me, there's my handle in Twitter as well. So check out Twitter and participate. Then, episode's goal to understand the Pareto principle. And what's the impact of it in the API development and providing the best possible developer experience in brief. And you've probably seen this kind of figures 80/20, and that's how most people see it, even though they don't recognize that it's a Pareto principle, and it's also known as the law of the vital few or the principle of factor sparsity. It's known to be kind of a universal truth about the imbalance of input and output. So we'll go into the details in what it actually means. Brief information also that actually the person, according to whom this is the principle is named, is Vilfredo Pareto, and he lived like a century ago in Italy, and he found initially that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. Okay, that sounded probably interesting for Pareto, and he actually verified the principle with multiple other tests in different contexts. So it's not just about the land ownership. And actually, what happened after that? It has been formulated as probably in a way that it's written here that okay, it's known as the 80/20 rule and the law of blah blah blah. And the most important thing is that actually it states that quite many events or factors or basically anything in economics and also in IT is that there's a rule that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. And this can be turned into different kind of variations, and basically there's the pie chart description of the same principle, so you understand that whatever you do, 20% of your efforts actually create 80% of the results. So you should basically focus on performing on the 20% and leave the 80% of your fiddling without much attention. But how to find out that 20% is an interesting thing. But yeah, a couple of examples from the IT industry. I took a look at some of the academic articles on the subject, and I actually found plenty of those, but I picked two. The first one is from Rooney's article, and it was stated there that the Microsoft actually found out that by solving the top 20% of the reported bugs, then 80% of the bugs and crashes were actually eliminated. So the quality of the application from end user point of view rised quite significantly. And there's the link also to the actual article. And the other one is from Gittens, Kim and Godwin, and they were actually doing some research on software testing. The test team actually found all the defects. Whoa, quite good coverage. Kind of expected that you find them somehow. And they found the 100% of the defects in 28% of the code. So it's not exactly 2080, but that's the idea that you shouldn't look at the Pareto principle as something that you should stick with 2080. It can be 70-30 or even 90-10 or something like that, or something in between. So it's not a black and white thing anyway. But anyway, in the test team, 80% of the defects was in 26% of the code. So what's significant is that 26% of the code. By fixing the bugs in that part, you actually increase the software quality quite a lot, and also increase the usability probably, and the user experience of the software significantly. So focusing on the most significant part of the defects is how you actually you can use the Pareto principle in that. Okay, so a couple of more examples from the API world related. I've tied them to the developer experience and APIs, but let's say that you have 80% of the bugs in software come from 20% of the features. Yeah, okay, you definitely don't want your API to be involved in the 20% of the features that are created. So whenever the application developer is using your API, then you don't want your API to be involved in that part where the most buggy parts of the code are. So make sure that your API is not causing those bugs. 80% of the complexity is actually coming from 20% of the code. And again, you don't want your API to be causing the complexity, but actually the other way around, make it more simple to maintain and implement and so on. And then the user side, the users of the application normally actually use 20% of the features, and that's important for the 80% of the users. So and you want your API to be enabling that important 20% of the features. That's how you actually make sure that your API is useful and important also for the software developer. And then last point is that 80% of the time of the team actually goes with the 20% of the application. So this is your chance as an API owner to actually increase the productivity of the developers who actually use your API by reducing the time to need it to achieve the wanted goals and results with your API. So you can actually help in decreasing that 80%. But okay, these are a couple of examples, and then how you actually use the Pareto principle. You need to apply Pareto chart analysis, and again, this kind of analysis can be used regardless of basically, is it a business process, workflow, documentation, practice, API guides, API documentation. Basically all things can be included here. So, and the point of actually using and thinking about Pareto is that you normally it's best for if you need to optimize something. You have something, but you need to make it better. So that's when you actually are bound to cross with the Pareto. Okay, let's twist it around. The inverse Pareto principle should be applied to actually when a new consumer, a new developer comes to your API. You want to have the inverse Pareto curve in the learning. So you want them to get the most of the features Remember that that's 20% that they actually want and need in 80% of the cases. They want to learn how to take advantage of that 20% as fast and easily as possible. So again, 20% of your API is probably something that 80% of the developers mostly need. Make sure that they achieve that as easily as possible. Okay, information overflow. The developers are given a lot of information in, for example, developer portals, API documentations, other documentations, video guides and textual guides, and so on, how to use your API, what's the use case, and yada, 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 yada. But actually, not all the developers are alike, and they don't do exactly the same thing. They do some parts exactly the same, because otherwise your API is not focused. And 80% of the developers need actually 20% of your content to actually achieve the goal. And if it's not that, then something is wrong with your API. You don't want to cause information overflow to the developers, because the longer it takes the more the developer needs to read any kind of documentations or anything to get something done, the less productive they actually are. Okay, let's take a couple of examples. This is from the platform of trust context, where we have, roughly speaking, two kind of developers. We have data consumers, normally the application developers who actually consume the data, and then we have data source integration engineers who actually enable that data from various systems actually flows to the platform and is available for the application developer to consume. So in this way of thinking, let's say the documentations and the guides and everything, that would be 50-50. We're not even close to 80-20 now. Okay, both need different content and tools. They have definitely different needs, and that's why both of these sites are in the whole developer portal, covered from all the aspects. But again, let's go further. Let's look at the application developer alone. So it was initially 50% of the documentation, for example. Some of these developers actually know by experience OAuth and all the authentication practices and flows, how it goes. So they don't need to read anything from us or anywhere else. So they need 40% of all the material that we have in the developer portal. Now, that novice developer, novice in platform of trust, quite soon, as fast as possible, becomes more experienced developer in this context, and already knows the OAuth again by heart, has an account, is more experienced, knows some of the practices, how, for example, our APIs behave, so they don't need to read everything. So in this point, they need to know 20% of the content. Again, now we're getting close to the 80-20% thinking. So not all the developers exactly need all the information that you have, and you actually want to find out what is that 20% that 80% of your developers actually need. So how to offer that needed 20% of information and avoid the information overflow for the 80% of the consumers and 80% of their goals? That's the big question. So one of the ways is to actually do some targeted getting started packages, and that can be done by doing some guides, which are code level examples and some text elements describing what's going to happen and why, and putting those together. So one single guide is describing one element of the context, and then you combine these guides into bigger sets, and these become the packages. Let's say one package for the application developer and one package for the data integration engineer. But both of these packages might contain similar or same guides exactly. So you would do one guide once and reuse that in both contexts. That's one way to do it. Again, you're giving the developer, for example, the application developer, exactly what that person needs, and reduce the noise of the integration engineer oriented material. Of course, you need to have a clear structure in whatever you have. Is it a developer portal? Is it the API documentation? Is it some other documentation? It has to have clear menu. This is what I found out in one of the surveys I did among the API consumers, that the clear menu is one of the things they actually want to see, because that makes it faster to find information. And then conventions, use those as much as possible. So because in those cases, if you have the right keywords in the topics or subheadings and in the paragraph texts, then they actually it catches the eye, and they exactly know what is actually needed here, what is the information needed here, and they possibly don't need to read everything, and they can go forward faster and faster. And then efficient search, because we can't fulfill and know all the information that actually the developers and the consumers need. So you need to have a really good search in whatever you provide. And the key part is to actually analyze how the search is used and learn from it. So that way you know what are the developers actually looking for if they haven't found what they actually needed in the first place. So this is one of the analytical tools to actually improve all the packages and customer paths and everything in your developer portal, but also in your API documentation. That's how you find out what is the 20% in a mostly wanted part of the information. Okay, example 1. In this example, developer wants to list all products with the API from Platform of Trust. Simple task. How to do it? What information the developer actually needs is to find the documentation. Probably comes from Google or then from the developer.oftrust.net, and then actually comes to the documentation, API documentation. There's a screenshot from part of it. On the right, and they actually need to find out the product listing endpoint. Well, okay, they found it. It's a product. Under there is the all the endpoints for that, and then they need to know how to call the API with preferred programming language. The API documentation contains code examples for all the endpoints. How to use those? It's not in the picture, but it's in the documentation itself. And then what are the responses expected from the APIs? Of course, they probably want to know error handling and things like that as well. But the basic thing to get started would be that way. So by reordering, if you have, for example, if you have multiple APIs in your documentation, like in this one, each of these application, ACL, broker, calendar, identity, message, product, and so on, those are all APIs exactly. And you want to see and analyze how and which of these objects in the documentation are actually accessed by the developers, and in which order, and what they actually do after that. So because then you will be able to know how to reorder the endpoints close to each other, so the developer doesn't have to look for that, but it feels natural that it's close to the endpoint that actually is needed, for example, in the next step. This is not so simple, and you need to do a lot of testing and see how it can be done in your own documentation. But again, the key thing is that you need to analyze the how the developers actually use your documentation. Second example is from the guides. So, for example, we provide smallish size guides for different things that developers normally want and need to do in the platform, either to integrate new data sources or then consume the data in the applications and register applications and so on. So in this example, the developer actually wants to register an application to the platform. So what information the developer actually needs? Again, find the developer portal and the guides in there as easy and fast as possible. And then they need to find out the how-to guide on registering the application. Well, luckily we have one, and then there's a step-by-step guide with the code examples on the guide itself, how to do it with the explanations. And most likely the application developer also needs to add the authentication to the application as well, actually to access even the data products. So we have put those two close to each other, because most likely the developer needs the second guide as well. But again, this is something that you need to think again if you have multiple guides, and how to reorder those close to each other so the relevant ones are next to each other, because that makes the developer's workflow faster again. And again, what is the most important guides for given segments of your developers that you have to find out, and that's your 20% of the information that you need to focus most on. Examples 3 and 4. When you have the APIs built, and then you're thinking which APIs or endpoints should I actually optimize? Again, use the Pareto. So optimize performance, usability, and reliability of the most needed and the most important APIs and endpoints. That is the 20% that is mostly and in 80% of the cases used by the developers. Focus on that and leave the 80% of your APIs and endpoints as it is, because putting effort on that instead of the 20% is like waste of time and resources. So optimizing the part that actually matters the most, focus on that. Again, use the API management if you have one, hopefully, to find out what APIs are used the most, what endpoints are under most stressful usage, and then start optimizing the design of those endpoints and the performance and usability and so on. Example 4, some companies and the platforms specifically provide multiple APIs, and then they start to consider, should we actually build a code library to enable more fluent developer experience for the consumers? And then they start wondering what APIs and endpoints should be included in the libraries. Yes, again, Pareto comes to the rescue. So most likely the consumers actually need in 80% of their cases just 20% of your API capabilities. These capabilities might be scattered around your APIs and even in the endpoints inside the APIs probably. So you should actually again find out. You probably know what APIs are needed in a sequence. So you should probably be easy to bundle those logically. But again, find out how many operations you need to support in the code library is up to you, and use the analytics again, and then your common sense, and try to think from the developer's point of view how to bundle those endpoints under code library functions. Okay, those were the examples. So this was the episode on Pareto principle and developer experience, and why should you care? Well, you can optimize with the help of the Pareto principle using the chart method, and you can gain insights on what to focus on and what is the most important part to focus on, and then by that you will actually increase your developer experience level to the next possible level. And a reminder of the open resource on developer experience, which I wrote previously, 100 days DX, so one post, 1 day, and that was finalized the last after the summer, and it's still open there in the 100daysdx.com. Take a look at it and find something interesting material there as well.